And we're going to continue with the 7th chapter of The House with a Clock in its Walls. Father Higgins, Johnny, and Fergie have come to the purple mansion where the clock museum of Mr. Finnick is kept. He doesn't seem particularly pleased to see them, and will back up a little bit to the beginning of their tour. Mr. Finnick held out his thin, well-washed hand, and Father Higgins put $1.50 into it. Then the three travelers followed the museum's owner into a vast entry hall that smelled of varnish, Roman cleanser, and Murphy oil soap. The place was immaculate. The woodwork glistened, and the rugs had been freshly shampooed. Everywhere on shelves and tables and hanging on the walls were clocks. Tall ones, short ones, spring-wound or weight-driven, Seth Thomas's and Waterbury 8 Days, and clocks made by all three of the Willard brothers of Grafton, Massachusetts. 4 grandfather clocks stood in a row by the foot of the main staircase, and they looked like an over-dignified and gloomy welcoming committee. The air was filled with a loud, chaotic storm of ticking, and as he ambled along through the rooms, Johnny couldn't help wondering if Mr. Finnick was annoyed by the fact that the clocks didn't all go tick and then talk at the same time. This made Johnny laugh suddenly, and Mr. Finnick turned and glanced at him unpleasantly. "What's so funny, young man?" he rasped. Johnny blushed. "It's nothing, sir. I just thought of a joke." "Did you indeed?" said Mr. Finnick coldly. "Tell us, and then we can all laugh." Father Higgins glowered down at Mr. Finnick. He was getting to like this fussy little man less and less. Mr. Finnick," he rumbled, "I wonder if we might see the Childermas clock. That's what we came here to see, after all. We're not especially, clock fanciers. But my young friend John here has a friend who's a member of the Childermas family, and so this particular clock has a sort of sentimental meaning to him. You know what I mean?" Mr. Finnick clasped his hands in front of him and cocked his head to one side. "Ah, a sentimental meaning," he said in a nasty, mocking tone. "How nice! Well, now, the Childermas clock is a recent acquisition of mine, and I must say it is very intriguing. Fine workmanship and a real one-of-a-kind item. Very well. If you're bored with the rest of my clocks, I'll take you to see it without further delay. Please follow me." Johnny, Fergie, and Father Higgins followed Mr. Finnick up a narrow back staircase. They came out on the second floor and walked down a long hall to the door of a room that had probably once been a bedroom. Inside were 2 large mahogany dining room tables. One had a display case full of buttons, button hooks, pipe tampers, and glass paperweights. The other held the Childermas clock. It looked pretty much the way it had when Johnny saw it at the Fitzwilliam Inn, except the woodwork was polished to a blinding luster, and the glass door over the face was spotlessly clean. Also, Mr. Finnick had set up a movable glass and wood screen in front of the dollhouse room part of the clock. Behind the screen, the room's furniture was arranged as it had been when Johnny first saw the clock, but amazingly, the oil lamp on the little oval table was lit. A pinpoint of flame flickered in the delicate glass chimney, and the lamp's yellowish light cast odd shadows over the rug and bookshelves and the tastefully papered walls. Quickly, Johnny glanced at the row of shelves to the left of the fireplace. There, next to a bowl of tiny apples, was a gap, a space where the skull had been. There was even a tiny glue blob to mark the spot. Mr. Finnick launched into a long, dull lecture that he must have memorized. Fergie and Father Higgins stood patiently, listening with their arms folded. But Johnny kept darting suspicious glances at the little man. Just why had Mr. Finnick bought this clock, anyway? Was he mixed up in Professor Childermas's disappearance? Father Higgins thought that he was. At least, that was what he had said. But now that he had seen Mr. Finnick, Johnny found it hard to believe that this persnickety, irritable man had spirited the professor away by magic. Mr. Finnick did not look much like a wizard. On the other hand, the man might be concealing his true nature behind a mask. All right, then. What if he had spirited the professor away? Why had he done it? On droned Mr. Finnick. He was talking about the double foliate escarpments and brass balance wheels. Suddenly, Father Higgins tapped him on the shoulder. He had a request to make. "Mr. Finnick, if you don't mind terribly, we'd like to see the inside of this little room up close. I wonder if you could move the screen and give us a little, guided tour." Mr. Finnick looked genuinely terrified. He seemed to be imagining the awful things that Fergie and Johnny might do with their big, clumsy hands if he were to move the screen aside. But then he calmed down. He loved to lecture, and if the 3 visitors were willing to listen a bit more, he might make the supreme sacrifice. "If you folks will just move back a teensy bit," said Mr. Finnick, waving them away with his hand. "Ah, very good. Now then." Johnny, Fergie, and Father Higgins stepped back a few paces. Then carefully Mr. Finnick set the screen aside. Taking a long, thin, spindly pair of tweezers from a pocket in his apron, he reached into the miniature room. Daintily he twisted a knob on the gas bracket to the wall. He showed how the drawer on the oval table could be made to slide in and out. He pulled the book out of the bookcase and laid it on the floor of the room. With the tweezer tips, he flipped a page or two to show that it was a real printed book. Mr. Finnick was a mine of information about furniture styles and fabrics, and what ormolu really was. But as he rattled on, Johnny got more and more disappointed. He had hoped that a tiny replica of a bill would appear, stuck into a book, or maybe it would be in a drawer of the oval table, or on the sideboard, or framed on the wall like a painting, but there wasn't anything that looked remotely like a bill. As Mr. Finnick lifted tiny umbrellas from the thimble-sized umbrella stand and tweaked the frames of postage stamp paintings with his tweezers, Johnny felt frustration and anger welling up inside of him. They really were not finding out a thing. Father Higgins scowled. He threw Johnny a sidelong glance, as if to say, "Looks like we lose, eh?" Johnny gave a little shrug. Father Higgins appeared to be fumbling about in his mind for some way to say goodbye. Finally, in the middle of one of Mr. Finnick's long sentences, the priest coughed loudly. "Mr. Finnick," he said, glancing at his watch, "I am afraid we have to be running along. We've got some other things we have to do." Mr. Finnick appeared to be deeply offended. He pulled the tweezers back and glared icily at the priest. "Am I to understand that you've had enough of my lecture?" "I didn't say that," Father Higgins replied with a smile. "I merely said we have to be running along. Now do you suppose you could show us the way out?" Without another word, Mr. Finnick slid the glass screen back into place. Curtly, he motioned for the three visitors to follow him, and he led the way to the front door. In silence, the glum little procession moved on down the hall, and finally out to the front door. When they got there, Mr. Finnick jerked the door inward and stood stiffly at attention like a dwarfish sentry. "Good day to you all," he mumbled, his lips barely moving. "Thank you for visiting the Finnick Clock Museum." Father Higgins grinned and made a mock courteous bow. At this, Mr. Finnick stepped back and slammed the door violently, making the glass pane rattle. Father Higgins shrugged and turned away.